Hi, this is Jeff Singleton with Here's This Agile Thing.
This is Mike Markey.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt Beam.
And what are we talking about this week?
Well, kids, we thought we would talk about the theory of constraints because we talked last week about a thing called tame flow. And at some point, we'll probably talk about Al Shalloway's thing called Amplio. And so I put together some notes here about why we'd want to talk about theory of constraints, aside from the fact that it's becoming it's becoming swallowed up or used in these new frameworks that we're seeing emerge in terms of knowledge work management and software development specifically. But it's been around for a while. I mean, Goldratt wrote this book called The Goal. I mean, he wrote several books. One of them is called The Goal. I think that's the fictional story of a person who discovers these principles, I think would be the way to say it. But that's been around, I don't know, since the 90s at least. It's been discovered and sort of leveraged in the knowledge work of those two frameworks that I just talked about. It's also got a bunch of really just interesting, whether or not you explicitly talk about theory of constraints, like name it, right? It's got a number of tools and mental models that are extremely useful. Things like throughput accounting. We talked about that a bunch in the Tame Flow episode. That comes from theory of constraints.
Okay.
Drum buffer rope, demand scheduling, the 5 focusing steps, current reality. Like there's a bunch of stuff that it might be very useful if you're coaching in a knowledge work environment.
So would it be fair to say that it would be difficult to even have a tame flow discussion without some reference to theory of constraints as well?
It's probably impossible, actually, because it's definitely based on it.
Well, cool.
It could be argued even that it's difficult to have a conversation about Kanban or any other approaches without discussing the theory of constraints.
100%. Yeah, at some point we should do a episode on lean, flow, theory of constraints, Kanban, Toyota production method, all of these things, Deming, right? The history of these ideas is also interesting, and there's a lot of material out there on that. And sometimes it's confusing. People talk about Toyota production system as lean or whatever. And so it might be useful to talk about where these ideas came from and where they're at today. But yeah, this is definitely one of the OG thought technologies you might want to use.
Okay, so what's in a nutshell? What is it when we're talking theory of constraints? What is it that we're actually focusing on here? What's the constraint?
The constraint.
Or what is a constraint?
Yeah. So a constraint is also known as a bottleneck, right? Mm-hmm. And all constraints are bottlenecks, but not all bottlenecks are constraints, I think would be the correct way to look at it.
Okay.
Technically speaking, the system constraint it's the part of the system that is preventing all the other parts of the system from going faster.
You cannot move any faster than the constraint, than the flow through the constraint. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay. So that's that old theory when you would do cross-country, they would talk about cross-country rally races where the entire team couldn't advance until all the cars on the same team crossed the finish line. So whatever car was the slowest was the one that was constraining the performance.
That's your system constraint. And Goldratt said, hey, this is a great big system you got here. And we understand that there's a lot of interesting parts to look at. But if you're not looking at the system constraint, you're wasting your time. Right? Because you can spend a lot of time and money and energy and attention building up this part of the organization. But if it's not the system constraint, you won't go any faster when you're done.
Okay.
And if there are multiple constraints, as there many times are multiple constraints, and especially large organizations that we work in, then focusing on anything but the most impactful constraint is a waste of time.
It very well could be. It's just you've got somebody who's got a pet peeve and they think that this is the biggest problem in their day, but that's not the thing that's actually holding everyone up. You've got a whole lot of noise going on around fixing something that you won't see any improvement in performance from because you've ignored the elephant in the room, as it were.
100%. And so in the last 10 years, let's say, trying to help companies transform, like larger enterprises transform, right? We spend a lot of time, I'll just speak my own experience, and I think that this is generally true across the industry. Agile comes from this place of we can't ship anything. Why are these software projects not working, right? And so Agile is about, originally, my understanding is, let's figure out how to get something shipped at the team level, right? Let's get good at delivering, right? We've sort of figured out how to do that, right? But it looks so. Sometimes the reward for doing good work is to have more good work, right? Sometimes you solve this problem and you find a new problem, and we figured out how to get teams to deliver at the team level, but it turns out to be a local optimization from a theory of constraints point of view, right? Great, you've got a team that can ship 30 story points. Even better, you've got a team that can ship actual software to somebody, right? Maybe it's valuable, but maybe you don't have the marketing stuff in place. Maybe you don't have the logistics stuff in place, right? You've optimized this team really well, but you're not going faster as an organization because maybe the team was your system constraint before, but now it no longer is. And so we're in sort of this awkward place of, well, we can train your teams, we can get your teams going super great, but the whole scaled system isn't going, even though you have super effective teams, the whole scaled system isn't going any faster because now you have a new constraint that's holding the team back. And what do you do about that if all you know is Agile stuff and don't have any theory of constraints sort of perspective?
Well, does it kind of depend on where the constraint is? So if it's no longer in the team's hands, it could be somewhere else in the system, I assume.
Yeah.
So what kind of constraints could we be talking about outside of your technical constraints?
Inflow of work, maybe?
Yeah.
A lot of times stakeholders, whether they're internal or external, they may make a request, but if there's no detail around it, or if the team needs feedback about something, but there's a delay in that communication back and forth, to the one of the principles, one of the 12 principles. This is why the business and technology need to work together day by day to eliminate, that delay in decision making and getting that feedback. So that's a constraint. We see this all the time. I'm watching it right now, where an idea comes down the pike for a feature, and a team interprets that, and they'll say, well, that's fine, but we have all these questions. Well, we won't be able to get back to the business user for another 2 days. So now you've just wasted 2 days. That is a bottleneck. That communication channel essentially is a bottleneck or a constraint.
Totally. Could be the tooling that the team uses, right? They can create the software, they can test it, they can make sure it's fit for purpose, but they can't promote it to a new life cycle or get it into the hands of the customer, right? Mm-hmm. That's another constraint. If you fix that, then there would be some other part of the system, presumably, but that would no longer be the constraint.
I had a team I was working with once where the constraint was the frequency with which the users were willing to consume new product. It didn't matter how frequently we were able to deliver. They didn't want it any faster than they had been getting it.
So it'd be like a market constraint.
Yeah. Right. So just how frequently do they want to do updates?
Yeah, and the Wikipedia entry, they talk about a number of constraints. Supplier constraints, like maybe you can't get the input from your suppliers quick enough. Mm-hmm. Cash constraint, you might run out of money. That's a problem for the system. Internal capacity constraint is probably the most frequent and most common one that we run into. So we just can't.
Just can't do anything more.
Yeah,
I'm already working 80-hour weeks. What more do you want of me?
And there are a ton of things we can do, like obviously the way that you set up the teams, the workflow processes, driving down work in process and multitasking, right? Mm-hmm. But if you don't have a theory to sort of ground that in and explain why the changes and those things would lead to greater throughput, it's hard to set up that pitch for executives.
Fair.
I think the other thing is some of those constraints are invisible. There are assumptions that organizations will make because they're policies, perhaps. Now, this is a policy that we've got, whether it's code reviews. And I'm not saying that that's a bad policy. It's a good policy, but it still consists of a bottleneck, or it presents a bottleneck, because if you've only got one individual that's doing code reviews, am I saying you shouldn't do code reviews? No, of course not. You do need to do code reviews, but you need to figure out how to expand that bottleneck.
Yeah. Does it have
So
to be
that you
an
can do
external
more.
constraint, right? You're
Right.
waiting for somebody outside of your team to do this review. Does it have to be that person? Could it be a person inside the team? Or should that outside reviewer be part of the team so that they're no longer an external piece? Like, what could you do to reduce the overhead associated with working with that constraint? And then what's the next thing that comes out of it after that?
So, are there any other parts of the theory of constraints that you think is interesting or helpful or relevant to talk about? Because we could talk about the 5 focusing steps. We could talk about drum buffer rope. There's some things I didn't really fully realize how powerful it was until I really started looking into it.
Well, I'm intrigued by the drum buffer rope just because it appeared on my screen as a colorful picture. So what is the drum buffer rope?
He asked
He
rhetorically.
asked rhetorically.
And we answered non-rhetorically. So the whole idea behind this is, again, you've got let's talk about it in terms of a scaled agile approach. You've got one team that is the slowest in your program, right? So you should, essentially the idea is you want to feed work to the other teams that doesn't exceed the rate of that slowest team. If you do that, you'll build up work in process in those other teams, and multitasking will go up and throughput goes down. So my understanding of drum buffer rope is that, and actually, like there might be an analogy here. One of the analogies I've heard to this is a group of marching soldiers.
Okay.
Jeff's nodding. So there's a person who I don't think we do this much anymore, but at one point in our history, when we went to war, we would have somebody beating a drum, right? And that would set the cadence for the whole group of soldiers, right? The idea behind the rope is that the person, okay, so it's literally a drum, right,
Yeah.
that we're beating, that sets the cadence. And then there's a rope that reaches out to the furthest person in the pack or in the group, right? And so the purpose of that rope is to keep people from going too far ahead, right? Because if you get too far ahead, you're too spread out, you don't have focus, your work in process goes up, right? And you're less efficient or you're less effective. So it's sort of a visual analogy in that sense. But the whole idea is you want to use systems level thinking, right? And you have to keep all the parts of the system relatively in line. And so this is a way of keeping the parts from getting too far away from each other, driving up work in process and all of the associated stuff that goes with that. Does that make sense?
So So the rope sounded interesting. How does the rope practically fit into the analogy? So if the rope is the mechanism that limits throughput of work in steps prior to the drum, right? The constraint.
Yeah. Yes, at the constraint, exactly.
Okay. So what is the rope actually doing? Is feeding into the buffer that goes then to the constraint, or
The rope is it's connected to the drum. The drum is the slowest part of the system, and it's preventing. I guess it might be dragging the drum forward if what's at the end of that rope is energetic enough. But it's in a software context, it would prevent the drum team, from committing from bringing new work into process.
okay. Well, so maybe we're literally talking about a pull system then. So we're pulling the
actually,
rope.
it could be. Actually, I misspoke. It's preventing the other teams from pulling work into there, because they would the ones that would have capacity.
Yeah.
The drum team is always working at full capacity because it's the constraint. So by definition, it always has.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Well,
Jeff, does that sound right?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. So I think we still would have the potential for the teams before the constrained team that they might produce more things than the constraining team could consume. Right? They're producing that step prior to them at a faster rate than it's being consumed by the constraining team. So there's going to be a buffer there that's going to be piling up. And so somehow the rope concept is to slow down the flow into that buffer.
Well, that's a good question. So technically it would prevent them from bringing stuff into in process. Mm-hmm. But there's a whole, in TameFlow, there's the whole process of buffer management, which is a large part of the framework. And they have these things called bubble fever charts, essentially, that let you see for all these teams, are you in the red? You want to be in the yellow, right? Because that's the level of capacity. So there's different types of capacity, and this is outside the scope of this, but there's the green capacity that you need just to do the work, right? There's sort of a yellow capacity that's protective, right? And then there's a red capacity that is where you're starved for work, essentially. And so because we use throughput accounting, we know we need some excess capacity, and that's a good thing. But we want to keep the buffer sized such that the team always has, you don't want it to be green because that means the team is going too slow, that you could give them more work to do, right? You want to keep them a little bit, not stressed psychologically, but, in a state such that because you're balancing the system. So you're using the bubble fever charts to make sure that each team has a intake process that gives them enough of a buffer, but not too much and not too little.
Mm-hmm. But you definitely don't ever want them to be starved for work. They're already going slow enough as it is. We don't need to slow them down by making them wait.
Yes.
Okay. So now we got to figure out a way to... So now we would look at that constrained team and say, what could we do to improve that situation?
Totally.
Okay.
And eventually what happens is, you keep doing these 5 focusing steps that we haven't quite talked about yet.
What are those 5 focusing steps?
So these are straight out of the goal. We talked about...
We talked about them last week, but Jeff wasn't here last week. So the 5 focusing steps were identify the constraint. Mm-hmm. Okay. Exploit the constraint.
Which means try to get it to... Some of this language is a little bit confusing, I think. Exploit means to get the constraint to speed up. Do what you can to speed up the constraint, right?
Well, so you're calling attention to it, in a sense. So then the next step is subordinate the constraint. Mm-hmm. So that's where you slow the rest of the system down to match the constraint, so that nobody is outpacing the constraint at that point.
Yeah,
so now
and that's where the drum buffer rope that's the mechanism. The DBR, I think, is the mechanism that lets you do step 3. It would be a way to say it. Okay. Does that sound fair?
Okay. And then elevating the constraint, which is trying to fix the problem. And then
or escalating it. Mm-hmm.
Right. But it's the goal is at that point is what we just talked about. It's what can we do to make that constraint better, to reduce the lag, to increase the throughput, to do something that would make the performance, to bring the performance of that constraint up, thereby allowing the rest of the system to increase in speed, or not, because maybe we've now uncovered the next constraint.
Right.
Well, and it seems like in the it might be specifically to get the other teams to take on some of that work, because in the Herbie analogy, it's everybody carries a piece of Herbie's gear.
Right, but that's that's elevating the constraint, right? Is one of the ways that we could improve that performance is by reducing the drag. In the Herbie analogy specifically, is Herbie's pack is too heavy and it's slowing Herbie down, so we distribute the weight to the other members of the team. That was one possible solution. There's probably a million other solutions that you could come up with, as anyone with a good sense of wonder could
could invent.
could bring about.
Yeah.
Right. So, hey, let's put some roller skates on Herbie and see if that, and then we'll tie a rope to him and we'll drag him along with everyone else.
Well, he beats the drum.
Yeah, exactly. At some point, the metaphor breaks down. But yes, I think that's all correct.
What's the drum beat? Well, that's the drum I beat you with until you catch up to everyone else.
Now, what's interesting is I always interpreted the subordinate step really as subordinating all other potential constraints or perceived constraints to focus on the one that is the most impactful. And maybe I've misinterpreted that. I don't know.
Well, I do have to correct myself on one thing. I said subordinate the constraint, and it's subordinate to the constraint. So slow everything else down to meet the constraint.
And the mechanism is the drum buffer rope to keep your eye on how fast the slowest team is going and make sure nobody goes faster than that. Everybody stays behind Herbie.
So he's dragging everyone else along, and it's a drag.
Right, but they never
stuck
get to camp on time, or at least before dark. So
Yep.
Well, at least
Which
they're
is
all
why
late together.
Yeah, but in business, sometimes that's not super rewarding.
I was just going to say, try selling that to your stakeholders. Okay, we're going to just slow everything down here. I mean, I've tried this before, and I've said, look, you've exceeded your capacity of the teams. Well, would you like to slow down your requests? No, thank you, I won't.
So now we're heading into other platitudes like smooth is slow and slow is fast. No, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? That's the way it goes. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So instead of Herbie trying to catch up by running and then slowing down even more because he's worn himself out, and then he's moving erratically. Now let's get Herbie on a steady pace, and now he's the drum. Everyone else is marching to his speed, which we count on to make the rest of the system uncomfortable, such that they would want to fix the problem. They want to weigh in, and it's like no one's really happy if they feel like they're underutilized.
Right.
Or at least we hope.
It's kind of like a grain of sand inside an oyster, right?
Irritant.
Okay. It's an irritant.
Comes a pearl.
Yeah, where are we going with this? Where's the pearl? Is this
Well, so a lot of people would tell you spit the sand out, right?
Oh.
To just get rid of it. But like if you force, maybe this isn't a great
Yeah, I
analogy.
know. This is okay. So you could spit the sand out, or you could endure the pain and just live with the pain, and it's just grinding away at you inside, a little at a time, until a beautiful pearl comes out.
This does not sound like a super great
that
pitch
beautiful,
to give to an
that
executive.
beautiful pearl is probably the person finally deciding that they're going to another place. I'm departing this place unto another place. Look at my pearl.
So the threat of it was, hey, let's actually focus on this and exploit and elevate the constraint, right? As opposed to just trying to go faster, right? It's the whole system marshals its resources, and it comes to a greater solution, which is to code it in this thing and create this brilliant.
Well,
yeah.
by subordinating to the constraint, the system, it doesn't matter how fast everyone else can go until everything you can't go faster than the slowest step in the process.
Right.
So when we subordinate to the constraint, we're subordinating to the speed at which the system can produce things. That's it. It can't go any faster. You can inject some sand into some of the other members of the team and make them irritated, but it's not going to make anything go any faster.
Yeah. Another way to say it is to say you're recognizing the reality of the whole system.
Yeah.
Right. Which is the whole system can go no faster than this. And the reason for it is because this subcomponent of the system, and you can rev up other parts of the system, but it doesn't actually take you anywhere.
Not unless you're doing that revving up does something to improve the constraining system.
Yep.
Like distributing work to the other parts of the system that have now spare capacity because they've had to slow down, or whatever the solution you choose, the solution du jour. Replicate Herbie. There are now 2 Herbies.
100%.
Yeah.
So that's the 5 focusing steps.
Okay. So we got
What
the
else?
drum buffer.
You
What else
know,
you got?
when I think about of the 5 focusing steps, and I think number 1 is the one that typically gets overlooked. It's that whole identification. There are tools that we can use to easily discover some of them, but it requires looking at the system holistically versus, well, we've got a slow team here. Time out. Let's bring the focus back and understand, well, number 1, why are they slow? There are contributing factors to any number of things, and if you gave them something that was very poorly defined, and you by the way, you stole a couple of their development people.
Just for a sprint or two, Jeff.
Yeah. Okay. So now,
100%.
if you're going on a 2-week sprint, so now for basically a month, they've had to struggle. And so if you bring that focus back out, and that's where I see a lot of organizations struggle, is bringing the focus back to understand, maybe even doing a 5 whys. Well, why is this? Why is this? And then beginning to understand, well, first of all, the problem is your inflow of work, for example. Maybe you're asking much more than the capacity that you originally had anyway. Did anybody ever look at that? Well, the team's working on 10 things. It's a team of 4 people. Why are they working on 10 things at once? All because we got to keep them busy. And so if we can get them to look at things like cumulative flow diagrams, WIP, and get them to understand, you see all this work here? That's a bottleneck. Why is that there? And begin to pick that apart. And that, I think, a lot of times is the struggle, getting them to see that it's not just one individual or one team. It's your system of operation.
100%. Yep. One of the first things that Steve Tendon would have you do for TameFlow is to create. So a lot of times teams have, even if they're doing Scrum, they've got Kanban charts for the different work stages that a story would go, from the backlog to in progress to testing to whatever, sign off to done. One of the first things he would have you do is create, for each one of those columns, create a weighting column for each of it, right? So that you can see, ultimately you want to see what is your touch time, the work time, versus what's the wait time, right? And that is, it's kind of similar to what we do with value stream analysis, where you look at all the teams and then you calculate, this is how much time the team has spent doing actual work, and this is how much time the team is waiting for the work, right? And so from the point of view of the work itself, it spends typically very little time in process being worked on, right? The amount of time waiting, right, it's kind of like you at the hospital, right? You spend a couple minutes talking to the cardiologist and then an hour waiting for the MRI dude. And you don't see that in the system, right? All you know is that it takes the team a long time to do stuff. But when you start with techniques like this, you can see, this is fine, this is fine. This takes 3 days of just waiting, right? So things like that can begin to sort of paint that picture for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, these sound like mechanical things that we can do to try to identify the problem, right? Somewhere where we could visualize what the problem is and thereby gain access to it. But doesn't there have to be a willingness to do that? Like, what's the thought process associated with enabling that constraint search? Like
that is the question. That is the really valuable question, right? It goes back to the mental models of the people involved. If people are really stuck on the cost accounting mental model, then they might not be convinced to do it, right? And so I think the way you make the case is you've already got all the data. If you're coaching a team or a program, like this data is already being recorded in Jira or Azure DevOps or whatever, the start and the end date's all you need. And so you could just create the flow metrics based on what they're already, like, with no additional effort. You could just go say, hey, the planning process suggests that we can do 50 points or we're assuming, right? But here's the reality.
Okay.
And here's you know, if you want to put more stuff through the system, you could either try a lot harder, hire more people, like exhort people to work harder, or you could reduce the waste, right? The time spent waiting. And that's typically much easier. So I think that's kind of the basics of the case. It's like we don't have to spend a lot of time or money or effort. We can just change the work processes so you're not waiting on stuff all the time and see if that drives up your throughput. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think it depends on the situation. You know, it's just like anything else. You can use a great tool, but if you use it in the wrong situation, it's pretty much worthless. And all it does, actually, it may just serve to irritate people more than anything.
Yeah.
Smack them with the agile hammer.
Which totally exists, by the way. Yeah, one of the things is theory of constraints has been used in manufacturing and physical plants and stuff like that for years. Applying it to knowledge work is a little different because, like, you can't, the cues aren't visible, right? You can't see, if you go to a physical factory and you see a pile of stuff before a machine, you know you've got a bottleneck, right? Whereas if you just look at a person who's trying to write code and you don't see that 7 people have asked for something this morning, and so it's harder, but the same principles I think do apply.
Well, you know, I think, and that's one of the reasons why we try to stress making the invisible visible. You know, knowledge work is inherently invisible until you deliver something. And in between, in that interim period, unless you put something on the board, it's very nebulous and it's invisible. And so when we walk in, what do? We say, hey, let's get something on the board so that we can see what the heck is going on. Making the invisible visible, and then they can begin to see with their own eyes, oh, yeah, we got a lot of stuff sitting here in this in progress. Why is that? And when they look at the cycle times and say, well, that's been in there for 36 days. Why do you have something in progress for 36 days? But until we can get them to use those tools of visualization, it is a lot harder to get them to truly see. I stepped on your mic?
No, it's just ultimately we got to get back to that corporate culture idea of willingness to look at the constraints or look at the problems without attacking the source, right? Mm-hmm. To hold them, like, you used the example earlier where, like, why are you so slow? It's like, well, I could give you lots of reasons, but I'm feeling like you're not going to take anything I say the right way. Like you're not here to listen. You're here to exact a pound of flesh or make someone feel like they're a problem for being the constraint in the system, right? It's almost never the people, right? It's something to do with the system itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is why coaching is so fascinating to me, and I'm not super concerned about being replaced by an AI anytime soon. It's
you
like
were you did a whole session on it.
I was concerned enough to record an episode. It turns out it's fine, but all these concepts are related to everything else, right? The question of why the team is the system constraint, right? If you start asking that question with the wrong tone of voice, you invoke psychological safety, which might be a major topic to discuss, or maybe not. But
I think it's probably a really good topic to consider.
Yeah, typically it is, and we'll have a whole show on that if you want.
Ordinarily, I would have jumped down your throat on that, but I just didn't feel like it.
Well, that's why I never talk, honestly, because I'm concerned about getting kicked out.
So is that it? Have we drained the theory of constraints topic?
I mean, the only thing we haven't talked about is throughput accounting on this show. We talked about it on last show. Jeff, any thoughts about throughput accounting you think are super interesting? Or
I think getting people to see things through a different lens of throughput accounting. And I don't blame organizations for adhering to the cost accounting, because that's what they were taught. That's what we were taught in college. It's like, you know what? And this is how CFOs come up, and all that flows downhill. And so that same mindset pervades everything. And so until you can begin to get them to see, and when I say them, I mean from CFO on down, sometimes collectively called the bean counters. If you can get them to see that there is a better way, but until you convince them, you're always going to have this conflict. So as much as we try to get into these transformation situations, and we can help teams, we can help squads, portfolio, we can do all that stuff, but until you change that mindset, that cost accounting mindset, and shift it, you're always going to still have this natural conflict where they're going through this annual budgeting, and it's all about cutting costs until you can shift that thinking. And that's why it's not even a mechanics thing. It's really a whole mindset shift of, okay, so we're not going to focus on cutting expenses. What do you mean we're not going to cut expenses? Yeah, actually, let's improve our throughput so that we can have limitless amount of revenues or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, it's the better that you get at the tactics, it's like the more it makes it obvious that you need to the strategy is the part that's lacking, right? Like you said, we now know how to ship stuff really well at the team level, but we don't know how to integrate that into the whole enterprise and like just optimize the entire system. I think maybe we need to get better at creating like just a basic comparison of you doing it this way, the way that's typically done, versus what would be true if we were to look at it the other way, right? You would have to be willing to let people be idle some part of the time, and why, like, what would have to be true for that to be acceptable, right? But also use the math. I think the math in the throughput accounting might be one of the best tools, because at the end of the year, if you make more money, like, that's compelling, right? I don't see you're not going to have an executive who's going to decide, no, I would actually prefer to make less money, thank you, right? They're not crazy, and but that's the way they're looking at it, and maybe coming up with better analyses or examples, or like breaking it down into the component steps, because there's a bit of the education in terms of the different theories, and then married up with what that means practically on the ground. I don't know. It's a legit challenge.
I think you'll always have an attitude of, more revenue is always better, which is fine. And, more revenue is easily correlated to more throughput. But there's always going to be a few, at least, that have this mindset of, okay, I want the more revenue, but I want it at less cost. And so that's where they get into the mindset of, all right, we did that with 10 teams. Let's see if we can do it with 5 teams and cut these other 5 out. But, okay, at a certain point, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. So,
yeah, and that's if you use the 5 focusing steps and just repeat, I think the idea is eventually you come to an optimized system where you can't squeeze any more waste out of the system, and you can't grow the throughput by making it bigger, and you've got a right-sized, optimized system.
Yeah.
So maybe you get there naturally just by looking at the metrics, just by observing what the system does. I don't know.
Yeah, but you got to be able to measure the baseline before you can determine what the impact of the improvement was. Right? Where are you now? And do it in such a way that it's an apples to apples comparison. Because just because you made less money or more money this year than you made last year, like, at what level? Is that before expenses? Is that, are we talking gross income,
right,
net income? Where is that accounting touch point being? having just gone through taxes for the year.
Maybe we should get a throughput accounting expert on the show and just like beat that person up metaphorically with words for half an hour and just have them walk us through the dirty details of this stuff. But I don't know anybody. Do you know anybody who fits that description? I don't.
I don't know. Do they wear T-shirts? It might help.
They could wear whatever they want.
Hey, if anyone out there in the listening audience, consider yourself an expert on throughput accounting and would like to be grilled by us
Metaphorically.
Let us know.
Please get in touch. How would they do that, Mr. Markey?
They could contact us via email.
What's that email address?
Do you have one that you would like to use? Do we have one for?
How about questions@htat.show? Do we have that domain?
We have the domain HTAT.show. All one would have to do is attach an email account to that. So why don't we do that? Why don't we create a questions?
Yes. What is it? Questions@htat.show?
Yes. And by the time
Questions.
you hear this, it'll be there.
Yeah, we can guarantee that because we control when we publish.
That's right. We will not publish this until it exists. That's how good
Question.
we are.
Yes. We have set up the
We,
DVR.
we now have a system constraint.
We sure do, and currently it's me.
Yes. But we do have an HTAT.show. That does exist. All we have to do is hook up an email account to it. So
I can make that show up here in the video too.
Ooh.
Questions@htat.show. All right, I think we have drained as much as we're going to do today on the theory of constraints.
Yeah, I do think it is a valuable tool in your toolbox for helping organizations achieve flow, a better flow. But I also think the one thing that it doesn't, we didn't talk about, but it does support the notion of continuous improvement. And so if you follow the 5 focusing steps, you end up back at restart, and there's always a way to find the next constraint and continue to improve. And at the end of the day, I think that's the most important thing. If people can continue their journey by continuing to improve, this supports that.
100%. Yeah, it's like a specific. It's not the only way to do continuous improvement, but it's certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
How will you know you succeeded? The measurement improved. So
100%.
all right. So this has been yet another Agile thing.
Indeed.
For Matt Beam, for Jeff Singleton, I'm Mike Markey. And you are the audience.
See you, everybody.
See ya.